The bay mare stood in the dusty corral with her head lowered. So still she might have been a statue carved from honey-colored wood. And Xander Granger knew the moment he saw her that she was all wrong for the kind of work his ranch demanded. He had ridden 20 miles from his spread outside Linden, Colorado, responding to a notice posted at the general store about livestock for sale. The year was 1882, and good working horses were hard to come by in this part of the territory. Xander needed an animal that could handle cattle, endure long days under the merciless sun, and have enough spirit to navigate the rough terrain of his property. This mare, with her soft eyes and gentle demeanor, looked like she would spook at the first sign of a rattlesnake. "She is 5 years old," the man showing her said. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he shifted uncomfortably as he spoke. "Belonged to my sister. She passed 3 months back." Xander walked closer to the fence, studying the mare's conformation. She was well built, her coat gleaming even under the dust of the corral. When she finally lifted her head to look at him, he saw an intelligence in her gaze that surprised him. She approached the fence slowly, without fear, and pressed her velvet nose against his outstretched hand. "What is her name?" Xander asked. "Willow. My sister called her Willow." Robert cleared his throat. "I need to be honest with you, mister. This mare was not trained for ranch work. My sister, she trained horses different than most folks. Used patience and kindness instead of breaking them the usual way. Willow here, she knows voice commands, will come when called, never kicked or bit anyone in her life. But I do not think she has it in her to run down cattle or work hard like you might need." Xander should have walked away right then. He had 2 other horses to look at that day, both geldings that came recommended by men he trusted. But something about the way Willow looked at him, with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a sorrow he recognized, made him hesitate. "Your sister, what happened to her?" The question came out before he could stop it. Robert's weathered face tightened. "Fever took her. She was young, only 26. Had been widowed 2 years before that when her husband died in a mining accident up north. Training horses was how she made her living after that. She was good at it too, had a gift. People came from 3 counties over to have her work with their difficult animals." The afternoon sun beat down on Xander's shoulders as he continued to study the mare. At 32, he had been running his ranch alone for nearly 8 years, ever since he had saved enough to buy the land. It was hard, lonely work, made harder by the fact that he seemed to have forgotten how to talk to people somewhere along the way. His days consisted of mending fences, checking on his small herd of cattle, and eating meals in silence at a table meant for a family he did not have. "How much?" he heard himself ask. Robert named a price that was more than fair, almost too low. "I cannot keep her," he explained. "I am heading back east to live with my son and his family. Cannot take a horse with me on the train. I just want to know she will be cared for. My sister loved this animal like she was her own child." Xander pulled out his money and counted out the bills. It was foolish, he knew, to buy a horse he could not use for the work that needed doing. But he had 3 other horses already, all of them capable and hardworking. Maybe Willow could be a riding horse, something gentler for the occasional trip into town. He told himself this as he shook Robert's hand and took the lead rope. The mare followed him without resistance as he led her to where his own horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Buck, was tied. She loaded into the small trailer he had brought without any fuss, as if she understood what was expected of her. The journey back to his ranch took most of the remaining daylight. Xander arrived as the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the mountains in the distance turning dark against the fading light. His property consisted of 200 acres of grazing land, a modest house he had built himself, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a collection of corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair. It was not much, but it was his, and he took pride in what he had accomplished with his own 2 hands. He settled Willow into a stall in the barn, giving her fresh water and hay. She ate delicately, not with the aggressive hunger of his other horses, but with a careful consideration that seemed almost human. As he watched her, he wondered about the woman who had trained her, the widow who had poured love into teaching this animal. The next morning, Xander woke before dawn as always and went about his usual routine. He fed all the animals, checked the water troughs, and surveyed his fences for any damage. It was only when he returned to the barn at mid-morning that he thought about trying to ride Willow. He needed to go into Linden for supplies, and it would be a good test to see how she handled. When he entered her stall with the saddle, she turned her head to watch him but did not move away. He spoke to her softly as he worked, telling her what he was doing, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a horse like she was a person. But she seemed to respond to his voice, her ears flicking forward attentively. The saddle settled onto her back without issue. When he tightened the girth, she did not bloat her belly or dance away like some horses did. She simply stood there, patient and trusting. When he led her out into the yard and swung himself into the saddle, she did not so much as twitch. The ride into Linden took just over an hour. Willow had a smooth gait that was easier on his back than Buck's jarring trot. She responded to the lightest touch of the reins, as if she could read his thoughts. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, Xander was beginning to understand what Robert had meant about his sister's training methods. This was not a broken horse who obeyed out of fear. This was a partner who cooperated out of trust. Linden was a small town, just a main street with a dozen buildings clustered around it. The general store, the saloon, the church, the blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments served the scattered ranchers and miners who made their homes in the surrounding area. Xander tied Willow to the hitching post outside the general store and went inside to place his order for supplies. Martha Hopkins, who ran the store with her husband, greeted him with her usual friendly smile. "Xander Granger, I have not seen you in town for nearly a month. I was beginning to think you had decided to become a hermit permanently." "Just been busy with the ranch," he replied, handing her his list. "Cattle needed moving to the summer pasture. Doing all that alone. You need to hire some help or better yet, find yourself a wife." She said it teasingly, but Xander felt his jaw tighten anyway. It was a familiar refrain, one he heard from well-meaning folks every time he came to town. "I am managing fine on my own," he said, keeping his voice even. Martha's expression softened. "Of course you are. I will have these things ready for you within the hour. That is a new horse you rode in on, is it not? She is a beauty. Just bought her yesterday. She was trained by a widow over by Parker Creek." "Oh, you must mean Zara Owens. I heard she passed recently." "Terrible tragedy. She was such a lovely woman. She came through here a few times bringing horses to sell at the market. Always spoke so kindly to everyone." Martha shook her head sadly. "This land is hard on women alone." Xander felt something catch in his chest at the name. Zara. The woman who had trained Willow with love and patience was named Zara. He found himself wanting to know more about her, this stranger who had died before he could ever meet her. He left the store and walked down to the saloon, thinking he might have a beer while he waited for his supplies to be ready. The interior was dim and cool, a relief from the bright sunshine outside. A few men sat at tables playing cards, and the bartender nodded at Xander in recognition. "Whiskey or beer?" the man asked. "Beer." Xander settled onto a stool at the bar, watching the foam rise in the glass as it was poured. "Say, you are the fellow who has that spread north of here, right? A man at a nearby table called out. He was younger than Xander, maybe in his mid-20s, with the look of a cowhand about him. "You looking for any help? I am good with cattle and horses both." Xander turned to look at him more carefully. The young man had an open, honest face, and his clothes, while worn, were clean and well-maintained. "What is your name?" "James Peterson. I have been working for the Diamond Ranch, but they are cutting back their crew for the winter. I am looking for something more permanent." "I run a small operation," Xander said slowly. "Cannot pay much. I am not looking to get rich, just need steady work and a place to sleep." James stood and walked over to the bar, extending his hand. "I am a hard worker, mister. I will prove it to you if you give me a chance." Xander considered. He really could use the help, especially now that he had bought a horse that probably could not handle the harder work. Having another set of hands would make the daily operations run more smoothly. And there was something earnest about James that he appreciated. "Come out to my place tomorrow morning. We will see how you do for a week, and if it works out, we can talk about making it permanent. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board." James's face broke into a wide grin. "Thank you, sir. You will not regret it. Where exactly is your ranch?" Xander gave him directions, finished his beer, and returned to the general store to collect his supplies. As he loaded the bags onto Willow, being careful to balance the weight evenly, he realized it had been a strange couple of days. He had bought a horse he did not need and hired a ranch hand he had not been planning to hire. It was unlike him to be so impulsive. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful. The afternoon sun was warm but not oppressive, and a light breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Willow maintained a steady pace, not rushing but not dawdling either. Xander found his thoughts drifting to Zara Owens, the woman who had created such a willing and gentle partner in this horse. She must have spent countless hours working with Willow, building that foundation of trust. What kind of person did that? What kind of patience and love did it require? When he reached home, he unsaddled Willow and turned her out into the corral with his other horses. They sniffed at each other cautiously, establishing their hierarchy. Willow did not challenge any of them, simply found a spot in the shade and stood quietly, her eyes half closed in the warmth of the day. That evening, Xander sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The loneliness that was his constant companion felt heavier than usual. He had grown accustomed to it over the years, had told himself that it was just part of the life he had chosen. But something about learning of Zara's death, of imagining her working alone with her horses, building a life for herself after tragedy, made him feel the weight of his solitude more keenly. James Peterson arrived the next morning just after sunrise, riding a dun-colored mare and leading a pack mule with his belongings. Xander showed him to the small bunkhouse behind the barn, a simple structure with 2 bunks, a stove, and a table. It had been empty since Xander built it, but he had always hoped to have helped someday. "It is not fancy," Xander said, "but it is solid and will keep you dry." "It is perfect," James replied, setting his bags on one of the bunks. "Where do you want me to start?" They fell into a routine quickly. James proved to be as capable as he had claimed, and more importantly, he seemed to understand that Xander was not much of a talker. They worked side by side in companionable silence, speaking only when necessary to coordinate their efforts. James had a way with the cattle and showed good judgment in handling the daily tasks of ranch life. After a week, Xander told him the job was his permanently if he wanted it. James accepted with obvious relief and gratitude. Having another person on the property changed the atmosphere in ways Xander had not anticipated. The ranch felt less like a hermitage and more like a working operation. Meals were less lonely, even if they were often quiet. And James had a sense of humor that occasionally broke through Xander's serious demeanor, making him laugh in spite of himself. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after James had arrived, they were mending a fence line when James asked about Willow. "That bay mare you bought, you do not use her for ranch work much, do you?" "No," Xander admitted. "She is too gentle for it. Her previous owner trained her differently. I heard in town that she belonged to Zara Owens before she died. People spoke highly of her, said she had a real gift with horses." James hammered a nail into a fence post with steady strokes. "Did you know there is a whole journal of her training methods? Her brother was trying to sell it along with her other belongings." Xander's hands stilled on the wire he was stringing. "A journal?" "Yes, I guess she wrote down everything she learned, all her techniques and philosophies. Robert Caldwell mentioned it when I asked him about buying a horse a while back. I could not afford anything at the time, but I remember him saying it." That evening, Xander could not stop thinking about the journal. He told himself it was foolish to be interested, that it did not matter how Zara had trained Willow. But the idea of reading her words, of understanding her methods, would not leave his mind. The next time he went into town, he sought out Martha Hopkins at the general store. "Martha, do you know how I might contact Robert Caldwell, the man who was selling his sister's horses and belongings?" Martha looked up from the ledger she was writing in. "Oh, Robert left for the East already. But I think he left some of Zara's things with Pastor Williams at the church, asked him to distribute them to anyone who might want them. You could check there." The white church at the end of Main Street was a simple building with a tall steeple. Xander found Pastor Williams in the sanctuary, arranging hymnals in the pews. The pastor was a kind-faced man in his 50s who had served the Linden community for more than a decade. "Xander Granger, what brings you by?" the pastor asked, setting down the books he was holding. "I heard that Robert Caldwell left some of his sister's belongings here. I bought one of her horses and I am interested in her training journal if it is still available." Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "Yes, he did leave several items. Zara's journal is among them. Robert hoped it would go to someone who would appreciate her approach to working with animals. Come with me to the office." The pastor's office was a small room at the back of the church, lined with bookshelves and smelling of old paper and beeswax. He retrieved a wooden box from a shelf and opened it carefully. Inside were several personal items: a brush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, a small Bible, a cameo brooch, and a leather-bound journal. "This is it," Pastor Williams said, lifting out the journal. "Robert said his sister started keeping this when she was first learning to train horses. She added to it over the years as she developed her methods." Xander took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was worn smooth from handling, and the pages were filled with neat, flowing handwriting. He opened it to a random page and read, "Today I worked with the chestnut gelding for the 3rd time. He is beginning to trust me, allowing me to touch his neck without flinching. I have learned that fear cannot be beaten out of an animal, only replaced with confidence through patient repetition and consistent kindness." "How much do you want for it?" Xander asked, his voice rough. Pastor Williams shook his head. Robert did not want money for these things. He just wanted them to go to people who would value them. If you will use it to continue Zara's work in some way, then it is yours." Xander thanked him and left the church with the journal tucked carefully inside his jacket. That night, after supper, he sat at his kitchen table with a lamp burning and began to read from the beginning. The journal was dated, starting in the spring of 1876. Zara would have been 20 years old then, newly married to a man named Thomas Owens. The early entries were full of hope and excitement. She wrote about learning to train horses from her husband, who had a natural way with animals. Her love for Thomas came through in every line, the way she described his patience, his laughter, his gentle hands. Xander found himself feeling like an intruder, reading such intimate thoughts, but he could not stop. Then, in the fall of 1880, the tone shifted dramatically. Thomas is gone. The mine collapse took him along with 6 other men. I do not know how to exist in a world that does not have him in it. The horses are all I have left of the life we built together. The entries after that were fewer and farther between, but they showed a woman slowly rebuilding herself through her work. She wrote about each horse she trained, the challenges they presented, the breakthroughs they achieved. She developed techniques that relied on building trust rather than enforcing dominance. She wrote about voice commands, about reading a horse's body language, about the importance of consistency and calm. Xander read late into the night, unable to put the journal down. Through these pages, Zara Owens came alive for him. He could picture her in the corral with Willow, speaking softly, moving with deliberate gentleness, celebrating each small victory. She had been alone, like him, but she had found purpose and even joy in her work. There was a resilience in her words that moved him deeply. Over the following weeks, Xander found himself implementing some of Zara's techniques with his other horses. He spent more time talking to them, observing their reactions, rewarding their cooperation instead of punishing their mistakes. James noticed the changes and commented on how much calmer the animals seemed. "Whatever you are doing, it is working," James said one morning as they saddled up to check on the cattle. "Buck usually fights the bit, but he took it easy today." Xander did not mention the journal. It felt private, something just between him and the woman who had written it. He continued to ride Willow into town for supplies, enjoying her smooth gaits and responsive nature. She became his favorite mount for any journey that did not require hard ranch work. Summer gave way to fall, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold. Xander and James worked long days bringing the cattle down from the high pastures, preparing for winter. It was during one of these long days that they encountered a problem. 3 head of cattle had gotten separated from the main herd and wandered into a rocky canyon. The terrain was treacherous, full of loose stones and narrow passages. "We need to get them out before dark," Xander said, surveying the situation. "But we will have to be careful. One wrong step and a horse could break a leg." They spent hours slowly coaxing the cattle out, their horses picking their way carefully over the difficult ground. It was exhausting, tense work. When they finally emerged with all 3 cows safely back with the herd, the sun was setting and both men were worn out. That night, over a late supper, James said something that stuck with Xander. "You know, I have worked on a lot of ranches and most of them are run by families. A man and his wife, their kids helping out. I never understood how lonely it must be to do this all alone until I saw you today. You have built something good here, but it would be even better if you had someone to share it with." Xander did not reply, but the words echoed in his mind after James had gone to the bunkhouse. He read more of Zara's journal that night and came across an entry that made his chest tighten. "I have been alone for over a year now. Some days the silence is peaceful, a balm after the chaos of grief. Other days it feels like I am disappearing, like without someone to see me and know me. I am becoming less real. The horses cannot fill that void, though I love them dearly. I wonder if I will spend the rest of my life this way, half present, going through the motions of living without truly feeling alive." He closed the journal and stared out the dark window. Zara had understood his loneliness because she had felt it herself. They were strangers who would never meet, connected only through the gentle Mare sleeping in his barn and the words written in a worn leather journal. But that connection felt significant in a way Xander could not quite articulate. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in late October. The ranch work slowed to the essential tasks of feeding animals and keeping water troughs from freezing. Xander spent more time indoors and found himself reading and rereading passages from Zara's journal. There were sections where she wrote about her dreams for the future, her hope that she might find love again someday, that her life might expand beyond the boundaries of her grief. The last entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before her death. Spring is coming. I can feel it in the air, see it in the way the light is changing. This year, I want to do more than just survive. I want to truly live again. I have been thinking about going to the dances in town, about accepting when people invite me to dinner. I have been hiding behind my work for too long. Thomas would not want me to live this way. He would want me to be happy, to open my heart to possibility. I am going to try. Xander closed the journal with a heavy heart. She had been ready to rejoin the world, to risk her heart again, and then the fever had taken her. It seemed unbearably cruel. He found himself wishing he could have met her, could have known the woman behind these thoughtful words. Would they have understood each other? Would there have been something between them? These were foolish thoughts, he told himself. She was gone, and he was projecting his own loneliness onto a stranger. But the thoughts persisted anyway, following him through the short winter days and long winter nights. Christmas came and went quietly. Xander and James shared a meal of roasted chicken and potatoes, and James presented Xander with a hand-carved whistle he had made for calling the horses. It was a thoughtful gift, and Xander found himself moved by the gesture. He had given James a new pair of work gloves and a wool scarf, practical items but chosen with care. In January, a hard storm moved through the area, dumping 2 feet of snow and bringing temperatures so low that the water in the bucket by the door froze solid. Xander and James worked together to keep the animals safe and fed, breaking ice from troughs and making sure no creature was left exposed to the brutal cold. It was during this storm that Willow showed her true nature. A section of fence had blown down in the wind, and 2 of Xander's horses had wandered off before he discovered the damage. Visibility was terrible, with snow blowing sideways and the world reduced to a white blur. Xander saddled Willow, knowing her calm temperament would be an asset in these conditions. He gave her head, trusting her instincts, and she moved through the storm with a confidence that surprised him. She seemed to sense where the other horses had gone, following a trail that Xander could not see. Within an hour, they had found the 2 missing animals huddled in a stand of trees, and Willow helped herd them back toward home. When they reached the barn, Xander dismounted and threw his arms around Willow's neck, overcome with gratitude. "You are a marvel," he said into her mane. "Zara trained you well, girl. She would be proud." As he rubbed down the mare's cold, wet coat, he thought about how Zara's touch, her patience and love, had created something lasting. She might be gone, but her work lived on in this remarkable animal. It was a kind of immortality, he supposed, to leave something of value behind. The winter slowly loosened its grip, and by March, signs of spring were appearing. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Xander's cattle, thin from the hard winter, began to regain their weight as the weather improved. Birds returned, filling the air with song. One day in early April, Xander rode into Linden for supplies and found the town buzzing with news. A new family had bought property east of town and was planning to start a horse breeding operation. The talk was all about the quality of the stock they were bringing in from further east and the prices they were asking. Xander was loading his purchases onto Willow when he overheard 2 women talking outside the general store. I heard they have a daughter, one was saying. Pretty thing, but I do not think she is interested in any of the local boys. Very particular, Martha said. Well, with the money that family has, she can afford to be particular. They say her father made a fortune in shipping before deciding to move west for his health. Xander mounted Willow and headed home, thinking little of the gossip. New families came and went, and he had learned long ago not to pay much attention to town talk. But a week later, Martha Hopkins brought it up when he came by to pick up a special order of horse tack. "You should meet the Olsons," she said as she wrapped his purchases. "They are good people, and they share your interest in horses. The daughter, Zoe, she is particularly knowledgeable. Her mother died when she was young and she learned the business from her father. I think you would get along." "I am not looking for company," Xander replied, more curtly than he intended. Martha's expression softened. "I know you are not, but sometimes the best things in life are the ones we are not looking for." That evening, Xander mentioned the conversation to James as they worked on repairing a stall door in the barn. James had become something of a friend over the months, the closest thing Xander had to a confidant. "You know, Martha might have a point," James said, fitting a new hinge into place. "You cannot live your whole life alone out here. I mean, I like working here and all, but I am planning to save up and eventually get my own place, maybe find a wife." "What will you do then?" "Hire someone else," Xander said. "That is not the same as having a partner, someone who shares the burden and the joy of building a life. You read that journal every night. I have seen the light in your window. What do you think Zara Owens would tell you if she could? She wrote about wanting to live again, to open her heart. Maybe you should take her advice." Xander could not argue with that, though he wanted to. James was right. Zara's words had been haunting him, pushing him to think about what his life could be instead of what it was. But the thought of actually pursuing that possibility, of making himself vulnerable to another person, terrified him in ways he could not quite name. 2 weeks later, Pastor William stopped by the ranch unexpectedly. It was unusual for the pastor to make calls this far out of town, and Xander invited him in for coffee, curious about the visit. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Pastor William said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "The Olsons, the new family I believe you heard about, they have been attending church services. Zoe Olson asked me if I knew of anyone in the area who practiced natural horsemanship methods. I immediately thought of you and the interest you showed in Zara's journal." "I am not a professional trainer," Xander protested. "I just have been applying some of her techniques with my own horses." "Yes, but you understand the philosophy, and that is what Zoe is looking for. She has some young horses she wants to train, and she is adamant about doing it the right way, with patience and respect for the animals. I told her I would ask if you might be willing to at least meet with her and discuss it." Xander wanted to refuse. The idea of spending time with a stranger, particularly a woman who might expect conversation and social niceties, was deeply unappealing. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was James's words about taking Zara's advice. Maybe it was the long, lonely winter that had just passed. Maybe it was simple curiosity about someone else who valued the kind of training methods Zara had developed. "I suppose one meeting would not hurt," he heard himself say. "She can come here if she wants to see how I work." Pastor William smiled. "I will let her know. Thank you, Xander. I think this might be good for both of you." 3 days later, a wagon rolled up the long drive to Xander's ranch. He watched from the porch, his stomach knotted with an anxiety he had not felt in years. When the wagon stopped and the driver climbed down, Xander saw a woman of perhaps 25 or 26, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than a fancy dress. She moved with easy confidence, tying the horses to the hitching post, before turning to face him. Zoe Olsen was not conventionally pretty in the delicate way that society often prized. She was tall and strong-looking, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was tanned from outdoor work, and her hands, when she extended one to shake his, were calloused. But her eyes were remarkable, a clear, intelligent gray that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mr. Granger, I am Zoe Olsen. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Her voice was direct, neither too soft nor too loud. "Call me Xander. Would you like to see the horses?" She smiled, and it transformed her face, bringing warmth to her features. "I would love that." They walked to the corral where Willow stood with the other horses. Xander called her name, and the mare's head came up immediately. She trotted over to the fence, nickering softly in greeting. "That is Willow," Xander said. "She was trained by Zara Owens." Zoe's expression changed, becoming almost reverent. "I heard about Zara Owens. They say she was remarkable with horses, that she had a gift. I never got to meet her, but I wish I had." There are so few people who truly understand that training should be partnership, not domination. "She kept a journal of her methods," Xander said. "Pastor Williams gave it to me. I have been using her techniques. Would you let me read it sometime? I would be so grateful." "I have been searching for information on these methods, but most of what is written comes from back east, from people who have never worked with Western horses in practical ranch conditions." Xander found himself agreeing before he had fully thought it through. "You can borrow it. But it is precious to me, so I would need you to take care of it." "Of course. I would guard it with my life." She said it seriously, and he believed her. They spent the next hour in the corral. Xander demonstrated some of the techniques he had learned, showing how Willow responded to voice commands and gentle guidance. Zoe watched with focused attention, asking intelligent questions that showed she understood the principles at work. "This is exactly what I have been trying to achieve with my own horses," she said. "But I have been doing it mostly on instinct, without a clear methodology. Seeing this, understanding the progression, it makes so much sense." James appeared from where he had been working on the far side of the property, and Xander introduced them. James was his usual friendly self, chatting easily with Zoe in a way that Xander envied. They all walked to the house, and Xander found himself offering lunch, something he never did with visitors. Over sandwiches and coffee, Zoe told them about her family's plans. Her father, who remained back at their property that day dealing with a delivery, wanted to breed quality horses for the growing market in Colorado and beyond. Zoe was to manage the training program, ensuring that every animal they sold was well-mannered and reliable. "My father knows breeding, but I know training," she explained. "My mother died when I was 8, and I essentially grew up in the stables. Working with horses is all I have ever wanted to do." There was something in the way she said it, a deep passion that resonated with Xander. This was not a woman playing at ranching or dabbling in horses as a hobby. This was someone who understood that working with animals was a calling, a way of life that got into your blood and bones. When Zoe left that afternoon, she took Zara's journal with her, promising to return it within the week. Xander watched her wagon roll down the drive, feeling unsettled in a way he could not quite define. He had expected to dislike the meeting, to find it awkward and uncomfortable. Instead, he had found it surprisingly easy to talk to her. She spoke his language, understood his world. "She is different," James said, coming to stand beside him on the porch. "Most women I have met would not know a pastern from a fetlock, but she clearly knows her horses. And she did not flutter her eyelashes at you once, which makes a nice change from the ladies in town who are always trying to catch your attention." Xander had not noticed any ladies trying to catch his attention, but he did not say so. "She just wants to learn the training methods." Sure, James agreed, but there was a knowing tone in his voice that made Xander scowl. Zoe returned 4 days later with the journal, a loaf of fresh bread as a thank-you gift, and an invitation. "My father would like to meet you," she said. "He is hosting a small dinner at our home this Saturday evening. Just a few local ranchers and their families. We would be honored if you would come." Xander almost refused automatically. He did not do social gatherings, had avoided them for years. But Zoe was looking at him with those clear gray eyes, and he heard himself accepting before his brain caught up with his mouth. Saturday evening found him riding Willow toward the Olsen property, feeling absurdly nervous. He had dug out his one good shirt, the one he wore to church on the rare occasions he attended, and James had helped him trim his hair and beard so he looked more civilized. James had found the whole thing highly amusing, and Xander had threatened to dock his pay if he did not stop teasing. The Olsen property was impressive, with a large main house built in a modern style, a massive barn that looked like it could house 30 horses, and extensive corrals and pastures. Clearly, the family had significant resources. Xander felt a moment of inadequacy, thinking of his own modest spread with its leaning barn and patched-together outbuildings. But when Zoe greeted him at the door, her smile was so genuine and welcoming that his anxiety eased somewhat. She introduced him to her father, Robert Olsen, a robust man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "Zoe tells me you have been working with Zara Owens's training methods," Robert said. "I would very much like to hear about that." Natural horsemanship is gaining respect in some circles, but it is still considered too soft by many ranchers. The dinner party consisted of about a dozen people, all connected to ranching or horses in some way. Xander found himself seated next to Zoe, and she drew him into the conversation with an ease that surprised him. She asked his opinion on various training challenges, and when he spoke, people actually listened. It was a novel experience. In town, he was usually dismissed as the quiet bachelor rancher who kept to himself. Here, his knowledge and experience were valued. After dinner, Robert gave Xander a tour of the breeding operation. The horses were indeed exceptional quality, with bloodlines that Robert had spent years developing. But they were young and unschooled, and Robert freely admitted that this was where his expertise ended. "Zoe has the gift for training, just like her mother did," Robert said. "But she could use a partner, someone who shares her philosophy and can help manage the volume of work we are anticipating. I wanted to ask if you might consider a business arrangement. You would train horses for us, using the natural methods, and we would pay you well for your time and expertise." Xander was taken aback. "I am not a professional trainer. I just have a small ranch and have been applying what I learned from a journal." "Zoe showed me that journal. I read every word. Zara Owens was brilliant, and you have clearly understood and internalized her work. That makes you more qualified than most of the so-called professionals out there. Think about it. You would not have to give up your own ranch. You could work here a few days a week, train our young stock, and teach Zoe anything you have learned. We would make it worth your while financially." It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. But as Xander rode home that night under a sky full of stars, he could not stop thinking about it. The idea of working with horses full-time, of dedicating himself to the kind of patient, respectful training that Zara had championed, was deeply appealing. And if he was honest with himself, the prospect of spending more time with Zoe had its own appeal. He discussed it with James the next morning over breakfast. James listened carefully, then said, "I think you should do it. I can handle most of the day-to-day work here, especially with the herd as small as it is. And the extra money would allow you to expand your operation if you wanted, or just give you some security. But I think the real question is not about the business arrangement. It is about Zoe. What about her? James gave him a long look. You like her. I could see it at dinner, the way you looked at her when she was talking, the way you actually smiled a few times. She is smart, she shares your interests, and unless I am completely blind, she likes you too. This could be about more than just training horses. You are getting ahead of yourself, Xander said, but his heart was beating faster. Maybe. Or maybe you have been alone long enough, and life is giving you a chance at something good. Zara Owens wrote about wanting to live again, to open her heart. You have been living her words secondhand. Why not try living them for yourself? The question stayed with Xander all day. That evening, he reread the final entries in Zara's journal, the ones where she talked about choosing life over mere survival, about being willing to risk hope and connection. He thought about the loneliness that had defined his existence for so long, and about the unexpected warmth he had felt sitting next to Zoe at dinner, talking about horses and methods, and the subtle communication between human and animal. The next day, he rode to the Olsen property and told Robert he accepted the offer. They worked out an arrangement where Xander would come 3 days a week to work with the young horses. James would manage the home ranch during those times, with Xander still handling the major decisions and any tasks that required his presence. The partnership began in May, as spring fully established itself across the Colorado landscape. Xander found himself falling into a new rhythm, splitting his time between his own property and the Olsen operation. Working with Zoe was a revelation. She was a quick learner, intuitive with the horses, and unafraid of hard work. They developed a shorthand, able to communicate with few words, reading each other's intentions the way they read the horses. But it was more than just a working relationship, though Xander tried to tell himself otherwise. There were moments when their hands would brush as they worked, and he would feel a jolt of electricity. There were times when she would laugh at something, and the sound would make his chest feel tight. There were days when he would catch himself watching her work with a young colt, admiring not just her skill but the grace and strength of her movements, the concentration on her face, the gentleness in her touch. One afternoon in early June, they were working with a particularly nervous filly. The horse had been mishandled before coming to the Olsens, and she was skittish and defensive. Zoe had been working with her for weeks, making slow progress, but the filly still would not allow anyone to touch her hindquarters without panicking. Maybe we should try what Zara wrote about in the journal, Zoe said, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. The technique where you mirror the horse's energy and then gradually reduce it. Let the horse teach you the pace instead of imposing your own timeline. They spent the next hour doing just that, moving when the filly moved, standing still when she stood still, gradually closing the distance but never pushing. It was meditative work, requiring complete focus and patience. Finally, the filly allowed Zoe to rest a hand on her hip, and though she tensed, she did not bolt. Zoe's face lit up with joy, and without thinking, she turned to Xander and threw her arms around him in celebration. It worked. Did you see that? She is starting to trust. Xander stood frozen for a moment, acutely aware of her body pressed against his, the warmth of her, the smell of horses and sunshine that clung to her clothes. Then, slowly, his arms came up to return the embrace. She pulled back, seeming to suddenly realize what she had done, and her cheeks flushed. "I am sorry, that was inappropriate," she said, stepping away. "Do not apologize," Xander replied, his voice rougher than usual. It was a victory worth celebrating. They stood there in the corral, the filly forgotten for a moment, looking at each other. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Finally, Zoe cleared her throat and turned back to the horse, but Xander saw the smile she was trying to hide. That evening, as Xander prepared to ride home, Robert called him into the house. The older man poured them each a whiskey and gestured for Xander to sit. "I am not a subtle man, so I am going to speak plainly," Robert said. "My daughter is the most important person in my world. She is smart, capable, and has a good heart. She also has not shown interest in any man since we moved here, and believe me, there have been plenty of young fellows sniffing around. But she talks about you constantly. Xander said this about training, or Xander showed me this technique. I watch how she looks at you, and I see something I have not seen in her before." Xander shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I assure you I have been nothing but respectful. I know that. If I thought otherwise, we would be having a very different conversation. What I am saying is that I would not object if you wanted to court my daughter properly. In fact, I would welcome it. You are a good man, hardworking and honest. You share her passion for horses and understand her in a way most men would not. I am giving you my blessing should you want it." Xander's mind was racing. "I am not sure Zoe would welcome such attention. We work well together and I would not want to jeopardize that." Robert chuckled. "Trust me, son, a father knows. She would welcome it very much. The question is, are you brave enough to try?" That night, Xander barely slept. He kept thinking about Zoe, about the way she had felt in his arms for those brief seconds, about her laughter and her intelligence and her passion for the work they shared. He thought about Zara's words, "I am going to try." She had been ready to risk her heart again, to reach for happiness despite the fear of loss. Could he do the same? The next time Xander came to work at the Olsen ranch, he asked Zoe if she would like to have dinner at his place afterward, just the two of them. She looked surprised but pleased and agreed immediately. That evening, Xander rode home early and asked James to make himself scarce for a few hours. James grinned widely but agreed, heading into town for the evening. Xander cleaned the house, which did not need much cleaning since he kept it tidy anyway, and prepared a simple meal of steak, potatoes, and vegetables from the garden he maintained. When Zoe arrived, driving her own wagon since she would need to get home before full dark, she looked nervous and excited all at once. Xander helped her down from the wagon seat, and their hands lingered together longer than necessary. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Away from the barn and the horses, they talked about other things. Zoe told him about growing up back east, about her mother who had died of pneumonia, about the loneliness of being a girl interested in horses when society expected her to be interested in needlework and social calls. Xander told her about buying his ranch, about the years of hard work building it from nothing, about the isolation that had seemed preferable to risking connection. "Why did you agree to work with me?" Zoe asked as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set. "You could have said no to my father's offer. You could have kept to yourself like you had been doing." Xander was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think it was because of Zara's journal." Reading her words, seeing how she chose to keep living even after losing her husband, it made me realize I had been hiding. I told myself I was content alone, but I was really just afraid. Afraid of loss, of vulnerability, of caring about someone enough that it could hurt. When I met you, I saw someone who was not afraid of those things, who threw herself fully into her work and her life. I wanted to be more like that. Zoe reached over and took his hand. Her palm was warm and calloused against his. "I was afraid too," she admitted. "After my mother died, I saw how it broke my father. He loved her so much, and losing her nearly destroyed him. I told myself I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me. But then I met you, and I started to think maybe the risk was worth it." Xander turned to face her fully, his heart pounding. Zoe, I am not good with words and I am probably doing this all wrong, but I would like permission to court you properly, to see if what I think is growing between us is real. Her smile was radiant. I would like that very much. He kissed her then, a gentle, tentative first kiss that held the promise of everything that might follow. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling like fools. Over the following months, Xander and Zoe navigated the delicate balance of working together and building a romantic relationship. They were careful to maintain professionalism during work hours, but their evenings and Sundays were spent in each other's company. They would ride together across the countryside, have picnics by the river, and sit for hours talking about everything and nothing. Robert watched this courtship with obvious approval, and James took credit for pushing Xander to take the chance. "I told you," he would say whenever he saw them together. "I told you it would be good for you." The horses continued to be central to their relationship. They trained together, combining Xander's knowledge of Zara's methods with Zoe's natural intuition. The young horses at the Olsen operation flourished under their patient handling, and word began to spread about the quality of the animals being produced. Orders came in from buyers across Colorado and even from neighboring territories. One day in late summer, Zoe brought Xander to a far pasture where a small headstone stood under a cottonwood tree. The inscription read, "Zara Owens, beloved sister, 1856-1882. She spoke to horses in a language of love. Robert had this placed here before he left for the East," Zoe explained. "He wanted her to rest somewhere beautiful. I come here sometimes and talk to her." I know that sounds strange, talking to someone I never met, but I feel like I know her through her journal, through what she created with Willow and her other horses. Xander felt a lump in his throat. "It does not sound strange at all. I feel the same way. Sometimes I wonder what she would think of us, of how her words brought us together." Zoe leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think she would be happy. She wanted to see love flourish, whether between person and horse or between people. Her legacy is not just in the training methods, but in the connections she helped create." That evening, Xander proposed. He did it simply, without fancy words or elaborate planning. They were sitting by the river, watching the water flow past, and he turned to her and said, "Zoe, I love you. I want to build a life with you, to combine our ranches and our dreams. Will you marry me?" She said yes without hesitation, and they sealed it with a kiss as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. They were married in October in the small white church in Linden. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and it seemed like half the territory turned out for the celebration. Martha Hopkins cried happy tears, and James served as Xander's best man, still taking credit for the whole thing. Zoe moved into Xander's ranch house, bringing her personal belongings and her extensive knowledge of horse bloodlines. They merged their operations, with Robert Olsen maintaining the breeding program and Xander and Zoe handling the training. The combined enterprise was more successful than any of them had dreamed, producing horses known throughout the region for their quality and temperament. Willow remained a special part of their lives. Zoe often said that the mare was a daily reminder of the love and patience that had brought them together. They never used her for hard ranch work, instead treating her as a beloved companion, and occasionally using her for demonstration purposes when teaching other trainers their methods. In the spring of 1884, Zoe gave birth to their first child, a healthy baby boy they named Thomas, after Zara's late husband. It felt right to honor the man whose death had set Zara on the path that ultimately led to Xander and Zoe finding each other. Robert was a doting grandfather, and James became an honorary uncle who spoiled the child shamelessly. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, and they named her Zara. By then, Xander and Zoe had published a book on natural horsemanship methods, crediting Zara Owens' original journal as their primary source. The book became widely respected among progressive trainers, and they received letters from across the country thanking them for promoting a more humane approach to working with horses. Life settled into a rhythm that was both peaceful and purposeful. Xander never forgot the loneliness of his bachelor years, and he treasured every moment of the family life he and Zoe had built. They worked together daily, raised their children together, and built their business together. It was exactly the partnership he had never known he needed. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Xander and Zoe would sometimes sit on the porch with Zara's original journal. They would read passages aloud to each other, still finding wisdom and inspiration in her words. The journal had become a treasured heirloom, something they planned to pass down to their children along with the philosophy it represented. "You think she knew?" Zoe asked one such evening, her head resting on Xander's shoulder. "Do you think Zara knew that her words would touch people she never met, that her love for horses and her courage in facing loss would create ripples that spread so far?" Xander considered the question. "I think she hoped her work would matter, that it would continue after her. But I do not think she could have imagined all of this. Sometimes the best things we do are the ones we do simply because they are right, not because we expect a particular outcome." Years passed, and their family grew with the addition of 2 more children, another son and another daughter. The ranch expanded as well, with James eventually buying property adjacent to theirs and starting his own small operation. The 3 of them became an efficient team, working together to build something that benefited the entire community. Xander taught all of his children to ride using the methods Zara had developed, and Zoe made sure they understood the history behind the techniques. Young Thomas showed a particular aptitude for horse training, while Zara, their eldest daughter, inherited her mother's keen eye for bloodlines and breeding potential. Robert Olson lived to see his grandchildren grown and starting families of their own. Before he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, he told Xander that giving his blessing for the courtship had been one of the best decisions of his life. "You made my daughter happy," he said. "You gave her a life full of purpose and love. A father cannot ask for more than that." Martha Hopkins, who had been the first to suggest that Xander meet Zoe all those years ago, became a close family friend. She loved telling the story of how she had tried for years to get Xander to socialize more, and how it had finally worked out. "I knew you just needed the right woman," she would say. "Someone who spoke your language." Pastor Williams remained a spiritual advisor and friend to the family. He often spoke in his sermons about how God works in mysterious ways, using a journal and a gentle mare to bring 2 lonely souls together. The story of Xander and Zoe became something of a local legend, a reminder that love could be found even in the most unexpected circumstances. Willow lived to the remarkable age of 28, pampered and beloved until the end. When she finally passed, Xander and Zoe buried her in the same pasture where Zara Owens rested. They placed a marker there. Willow, 1877–1905. Trained with love by Zara Owens, cherished by many. It seemed fitting that the mare should rest near the woman who had created her gentle spirit. As Xander and Zoe grew older, they gradually handed over more of the day-to-day operations to their children. But they never stopped working with horses entirely. There was something life-giving about the work, about the patient process of building trust and partnership with another creature. It kept them young in spirit, even as their hair grayed and their joints grew stiffer. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering that included not just family, but also the many trainers and ranch owners who had learned from them over the years. People came from across Colorado and neighboring states, bringing stories of horses they had trained using the methods Xander and Zoe had taught them. "This is Zara's legacy as much as ours," Zoe said in a speech that evening. She was a woman who faced tremendous loss, but chose to respond with love and patience. She poured that love into her horses, and through them, it has spread across the West, changing how we think about the relationship between human and animal. We are honored to have been custodians of her wisdom. Xander added, "When I bought Willow all those years ago, I thought I was just acquiring a horse too gentle for ranch work. But what I actually found was a teacher, a bridge to knowledge and eventually to love." Every person here tonight is part of that expanding circle, proof that one woman's quiet work can change the world in ways large and small. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories shared under a canopy of stars. Xander watched his children dancing with their own spouses, saw his grandchildren running and playing, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. This was what Zara had wanted for herself, what she had been reaching for in those final journal entries. Though she had not lived to achieve it, her words had helped him find it. As their 30th anniversary approached, Xander and Zoe decided to make a pilgrimage of sorts. They traveled back to the area where Robert Caldwell had originally sold Willow, wanting to see where Zara had lived and worked. The property had changed hands several times, but the current owners, when they learned who their visitors were, welcomed them warmly. "We have heard of you," the wife said. "Your book on horse training is famous in these parts. We use your methods ourselves." She showed them the corral where Zara had worked, now weathered but still standing. Xander and Zoe stood there hand in hand, imagining the widow moving through this space, patiently training horses, building a life from the wreckage of loss. "She was braver than she knew," Zoe said softly. "To keep going after losing her husband, to find purpose and even moments of joy. I understand it better now, having lived my own life, having faced my own challenges. She was remarkable." They visited Zara's grave one more time before heading home, bringing fresh flowers and sitting for a while in the shade of the cottonwood tree. Xander realized that his connection to this woman he had never met was one of the most important relationships of his life. She had taught him through her words, guided him through her example, and ultimately led him to the love that had transformed everything. At home, their children and grandchildren were thriving. Thomas had expanded the training operation, developing new techniques that built on the foundation his parents had established. Young Zara had created a breeding program that was producing some of the finest horses in Colorado. The younger children were finding their own paths, but all of them maintained the family's commitment to ethical, patient horsemanship. James, now in his 60s, still lived on his adjacent property. He and his wife had raised 4 children of their own, and the two families were as close as blood relatives. He and Xander would often sit together on summer evenings, reminiscing about the early days when it had been just the two of them working Xander's modest ranch. "Hard to believe how far we have all come," James said one such evening. "I remember when you bought that bay mare and I thought you were making a mistake. Shows what I knew." Xander smiled. "You were right that she was not suited for ranch work, but she was suited for something more important. She brought me to Zoe, to this life. Sometimes what looks like a mistake is actually providence." As Xander and Zoe entered their 70s, they spent more time simply enjoying each other's company. They would ride together across their land, not to accomplish any particular task, but simply for the pleasure of it. They would read together in the evenings, often returning to Zara's journal and finding new meanings in passages they had read dozens of times before. "You have any regrets?" Zoe asked him one day as they sat by the river, their favorite spot for reflection. Xander thought carefully before answering. "I regret the years I spent alone when I could have been building connections. But I also know that those years shaped me, taught me things I needed to learn. And they made me appreciate what we have all the more." "What about you?" "No regrets," Zoe said firmly. "Every choice I made, even the difficult ones, led me to you and to this life. I would not change a single thing." They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had become something of an institution, known throughout the West for its humane training methods and quality horses. Visitors came regularly, wanting to learn from the legendary couple who had revolutionized Western horsemanship. But for Xander and Zoe, the real achievement was not the business success or the reputation. It was the life they had built together, the family they had raised, the love that had sustained them through 4 decades. It was knowing that they had taken Zara's legacy and expanded it, spreading her philosophy of patience and respect far beyond what she could have imagined. On a crisp autumn morning in 1924, Xander woke early and went to the corral as he had done thousands of times before. He was 82 now, moving more slowly than in his youth but still strong and capable. Zoe, just a few years younger, joined him as she always did. Together they watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I have been thinking," Xander said, "about what we should do with Zara's journal when we are gone. It has been such an important part of our lives, and I want to make sure it is preserved." Zoe nodded. "I have been thinking about that too. What if we donated it to the Historical Society, along with our own journals and records? That way, future generations can learn from Zara's wisdom and see how her ideas evolved and spread. It would be a way of ensuring her legacy continues." "That is a good idea," Xander agreed. "Her words changed my life, and through that they have touched so many others. They deserve to be preserved and shared." They made the arrangements that week, setting up a trust to maintain the journals and related materials. The Historical Society was honored to accept the collection, recognizing its value not just to horsemanship, but to the history of the American West. As they entered their final years together, Xander and Zoe faced the approach of death with the same partnership that had characterized their marriage. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and built something meaningful that would outlast them. They had no fear of what came next because they knew their legacy was secure in the children they had raised and the ideas they had spread. Zoe passed first on a quiet spring morning with Xander holding her hand. Her last words were, "It was a good life. We did well together." Xander buried her in the family plot, next to where Willow and Zara Owens rested. It seemed right that the 3 females who had shaped his life so profoundly should be together. Xander lived another 2 years, cared for by his children and grandchildren. He spent his final days sitting in the sun, watching the horses in the corral and remembering. He thought about the lonely cowboy he had been, the gentle mare he had bought on impulse, the journal that had opened his eyes, and the woman who had captured his heart. He thought about how a single decision, buying a horse unsuited for ranch work, had changed the entire trajectory of his existence. When Xander died peacefully in his sleep at 84, his children found a letter he had written to be read at his funeral. In it, he thanked Zara Owens for the gift she had unknowingly given him, and he thanked Zoe for the life they had shared. He asked that his story be remembered not as one man's journey, but as a testament to the power of love and patience, whether applied to horses or to human hearts. The ranch continued for generations after Xander's death, still using the methods he and Zoe had championed. Zara's journal became a cherished historical document, studied by trainers and historians alike. The story of the lonely cowboy and the gentle mare became a legend, told and retold across the West. And in a quiet pasture in Colorado, 4 headstones stood in the shade of an old cottonwood tree. Zara Owens, who had started it all with her patient love; Willow, the mare who had carried her legacy forward; and Xander and Zoe Granger, who had taken that legacy and built a lifetime of love from it. They rested together in the land they had worked and loved, their story complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal. The circle that had begun with Zara's grief, and transformed into her methodical training of horses, had expanded to include Xander's loneliness, Willow's gentle nature, and Zoe's passion. It had grown to encompass children and grandchildren, students and followers, all of them touched by the simple but profound idea that patience, respect, and love could transform relationships between humans and animals, and between humans themselves. It was a legacy built not on conquest or domination, but on understanding and partnership. It was proof that the gentlest approach could sometimes be the strongest, that what seemed like weakness in the harsh world of the Old West was actually wisdom. And it all began because a lonely cowboy bought a mare too gentle for ranch work from a widow who had trained with love.